When they kick you out, it's not like in the movies. There's no dramatic shouting match, no slamming door that shakes the frame of the house. There's just a man in a cheap suit with a tired face, a clipboard, and a watch he checks too often. He hands you a thin manila envelope containing your birth certificate, your social security card, and a final check for $27.53. He says your name, then the words, "aged out." He wishes you luck, but his eyes are already looking past you, toward the next piece of paperwork on his desk. That's how it was for me. My entire life, all the chaos and confusion and foster homes and group facilities, all of it was reduced to a signature on a line and a handshake that didn't quite connect. I turned 18 on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning I was standing on the curb, the door of the North Gate Youth Services building clicking shut behind me with a sound that was quiet, final, and absolute. This story is about what happens after that click. It's about being left with nothing and finding everything. If you've ever felt like the world has closed a door on you, if you've ever been told you're out of time or out of luck, then I need you to listen. And if this story means something to you, hit that subscribe button and join our community, because we're all just trying to find our way home. The air that morning had the kind of wet, biting cold that seeps right through your jacket and settles in your bones. It was early October, and the city sky was the color of dishwater. My brother Leo stood beside me, his hands shoved so deep into the pockets of his worn-out hoodie that his shoulders were hunched up to his ears. He was 16, and technically the system still had a claim on him. But I was his only family, his legal next of kin now that I was an adult, and there was no way in hell I was leaving him behind. We had made a pact. Where I went, he went. It was the only rule that had ever mattered. He looked at me, his eyes wide and dark, mirroring the question that was pounding in my own chest. Now what? All we had were 2 duffel bags, filled with a handful of clothes, a few worn paperbacks, and the envelope the man had given me. And inside that envelope, tucked behind my birth certificate, was another, smaller envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed and soft, addressed to me in a spidery, unfamiliar handwriting. I had almost missed it. There was no stamp, just my name, Elias Vance, and the address of the group home. I stared at it, the cold making my fingers clumsy as I tore open the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of stationery from a law office I'd never heard of. Abernathy and Sons, attorneys at law, Hemlock's Notch. The name sounded like something from a fantasy novel, not a real place. The letter was short, formal, and devoid of any warmth. It was from a man named Arthur Abernathy, a senior partner. It informed me that upon the occasion of my 18th birthday, I was to take possession of the sole asset of my late grandfather's estate. My grandfather, Thomas Vance, had passed away almost 10 years ago, a distant, fuzzy memory of a man with calloused hands and a quiet voice who smelled of pine needles and earth. We'd seen him only a handful of times before our mother died and the state took over. The letter went on to describe the asset, a 2.5-acre parcel of undeveloped land in the unincorporated foothills of the Cascade Mountains, identified by a parcel number that looked like a string of random digits. It concluded with a stark warning. The property, it said, carried a significant tax lien and several outstanding debts against it, totaling just over $12,000. Mr. Abernathy advised that the most prudent course of action would be to sign the property over to the county to settle the debts, an action for which he had enclosed the necessary paperwork. He wished me well in my future endeavors. I read it twice, then a third time. A knot of bitter laughter caught in my throat. This was it. This was our inheritance. Not a lifeline, but an anchor. A piece of worthless, debt-ridden land hundreds of miles away in a town called Hemlock's Notch. Leo peered over my shoulder, his breath fogging in the cold air. "What is it?" he asked, his voice small. "Is it from Grandpa?" I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, the sharp edges of the paper feeling like a weapon against my numb fingers. "Yeah," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "He left us something. He left us a piece of land." Hope flared in Leo's eyes, a painful, brilliant thing. "Land? Like a house?" I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. "No, just land. In the mountains." The hope flickered, but it didn't die. Not completely. He'd spent his whole life in beige-colored rooms and crowded dorms. The idea of land, of something real and solid that belonged to us, was a magic he couldn't let go of. And looking at his face, at that fragile spark, I knew I couldn't either. The lawyer's advice was practical. It was sensible. But we had $27, 2 duffel bags, and a world that had just shown us the door. Sensible wasn't going to cut it. We needed a miracle. Or at the very least, a place to stand that wasn't a city sidewalk. "Come on," I said, pulling the strap of my bag onto my shoulder. "Let's go see our mountain." The first step was turning our few possessions into motion. We found a pawn shop a few blocks away, a sad little place that smelled of dust and desperation. I sold my old phone, a cracked screen model that was barely worth anything. I sold the silver chain my mom had given me, the one I'd sworn I'd never take off. Leo watched, his face pale, as I sold his portable gaming device, the only thing he'd managed to keep through 3 different foster placements. Each item slid across the scratched glass counter felt like giving up a piece of our past. But the past wasn't a place we could live. By the time we left, my pocket held $240 in crumpled bills. It felt like a fortune and nothing at all. Enough for 2 one-way bus tickets to a town called Redding, the closest major stop to Hemlock's Notch, with a little left over for food. The bus station was a purgatory of fluorescent lights, sticky floors, and the low, constant hum of human anxiety. Everyone there was either running from something or running towards something, and their faces all wore the same tight, weary expression. We bought our tickets from a woman behind a thick pane of glass who didn't look at us, her voice a monotone drone. The tickets were flimsy pieces of paper, but they felt like the most important documents in the world. They were a direction. They were an escape. We had 4 hours until the bus departed. We found a corner, huddled together on a hard plastic bench, and guarded our bags like they were filled with gold. I watched Leo, who had fallen into a fitful sleep, his head resting against the grimy window. His face, in repose, looked younger than 16. It looked scared. A wave of guilt washed over me, so strong it was almost nauseating. I was the adult now. I was the one who was supposed to have a plan, a map. But I was just as lost as he was, faking a confidence I didn't feel, steering us toward a patch of dirt I'd never seen, based on a letter that was basically a bill. Was this bravery, or was this the stupidest decision of my life? The bus ride was a long, slow severing. We pulled out of the city under the cloak of darkness, the streetlights smearing against the rain-streaked windows. I watched the familiar skyline, a jagged silhouette of buildings that had been the backdrop to our entire lives, shrink and then vanish. The city gave way to suburbs, the suburbs to flat, endless stretches of farmland, and then, as morning broke, the land began to rise. The world outside the window turned from gray and brown to deep, vibrant green. The air inside the bus was stale with the smell of processed food and disinfectant, but I imagined I could smell the change outside. The scent of damp earth, of pine. The mountains appeared first as a hazy blue line on the horizon, distant and unreal. But with every hour that passed, they grew larger, more solid, their peaks scraping against a sky that was turning a brilliant, crystalline blue. They were intimidating, majestic, and utterly indifferent. They didn't care that two brothers with $200 between them were heading into their shadow, looking for a home. We spoke little. The rumble of the engine and the vastness of the landscape seemed to swallow words. I pointed out a hawk circling high above a valley. Leo pointed out a river, a silver ribbon winding through a forest of dark green firs. We were trying to connect with this new world, to find our place in it before we had even arrived. We ate stale crackers and drank lukewarm water from a plastic bottle. It was a miserable meal, but we were together and we were moving. That was enough. Late in the afternoon, the bus groaned to a stop in Reading. It wasn't our final destination, but it was the end of the line for this leg of the journey. The driver announced a 2-hour layover before a smaller, local line would continue north. Stepping off the bus was like stepping into a different country. The air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of wood smoke. The sun felt warmer here, cleaner. We found a small diner across from the station, and I splurged on 2 cheeseburgers and fries. It was the first hot meal we'd had in days, and we ate in silence, devouring every last bite. I asked the waitress, a woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, if she'd ever heard of Hemlock's Notch. She paused, a coffee pot in her hand. "Oh, honey, nobody goes to Hemlock's Notch," she said, her voice gentle. "They only come from there. It's pretty remote, not much left up there but trees and memories." Her words should have been a warning, another red flag, but to me it sounded perfect. A place with nothing left was a blank slate. The final bus was smaller, older, and rattled like it was about to fall apart. There were only 5 other passengers, all of them older, their faces weathered like the mountains themselves. They looked at us with a kind of slow, neutral curiosity, the way you look at a new bird at the feeder. We were outsiders, and it was obvious. The road began to climb in earnest now, winding through switchbacks that offered terrifying, breathtaking views of the valleys below. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Just as darkness fell, the bus pulled over to the side of a 2-lane road. There was no station, no shelter, just a single wooden sign, its letters faded by years of sun and snow. It read, "Hemlock's Notch, population 112. The driver looked at us in the rearview mirror. "This is it, kids. End of the line." We grabbed our bags and stepped out. The bus pulled away, its red taillights disappearing around a bend, leaving us in a profound and sudden silence. The only sound was the wind whispering through the towering pines that lined the road. The air was so cold it felt sharp in my lungs. We were here. We were standing at the edge of our new world, and it was darker and colder than I could have ever imagined. The town of Hemlock's Notch wasn't really a town. It was a crossroads. There was a gas station with a single humming pump, a post office the size of a garden shed, and a long, low building with a faded sign that read, "Patterson's General Store." A handful of houses were scattered up the hillside, their windows dark. That was it. The place felt suspended in time, worn down by a quiet and persistent loneliness. A single string of yellow bulbs over the store's porch cast a weak, watery light onto the empty road. We walked toward it, our footsteps sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust, coffee, and old wool. A man with a thick gray beard and a flannel shirt stood behind the counter, methodically polishing a glass display case. He looked up as the bell over the door chimed, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "We're looking for a piece of land," I said, my voice hoarse. "It belonged to our grandfather, Thomas Vance." The man, Patterson, stopped polishing. He set the rag down and looked at us, really looked at us, for the first time. His gaze lingered on our worn-out bags, our thin jackets. A flicker of something, recognition, maybe pity, crossed his face. "Thomas Vance," he said, the name sounding strange and familiar on his tongue. "Haven't heard that name in a long time. He was a good man, kept to himself mostly." He squinted. "You must be his grandsons. Heard he had a couple." I nodded. "I'm Elias. This is Leo. Arthur Abernathy sent us a letter," I added, pulling it from my pocket as proof. Patterson nodded slowly, his eyes on the letterhead. "Abernathy. Yeah, he handles all the official business around here." He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "That land of Tom's, it's a rough piece. About 3 miles up the old logging road. Hasn't been anyone up there since he passed." He gave us directions, simple and stark. "Follow the road until it turns to dirt, then keep walking until you see a collapsed gate. That's the one." He sold us 2 heavy-duty flashlights and a box of protein bars, and when I paid, his rough hand brushed mine. "It gets cold up there at night, son. Real cold. You be careful." The walk felt like a pilgrimage. The paved road quickly gave way to a rutted dirt track that climbed steadily into the darkness. The trees pressed in on both sides, their massive trunks like the columns of a cathedral, their branches blocking out the stars. Our flashlights cut trembling circles of light into the oppressive blackness. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Leo walked so close behind me I could feel his breath on my neck. He didn't complain, but I could hear the fear in his silence. After what felt like hours, our flashlight beams caught something ahead. A pair of stone pillars, one of which had crumbled, and a tangle of rusted iron gate hanging off a single hinge. This was it. We pushed our way through a gap in the overgrown bushes and stepped onto the property. Our land. It was just as the lawyer and the store owner had described. Rough. A sloping hillside covered in dense undergrowth and spindly second-growth pines. In the center of the clearing, a dark shape resolved itself into a shack, or what was left of one. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken back, and several boards were missing from the walls, leaving gaping black holes. Hope is a fragile thing. Standing there, in the freezing dark, looking at that wreck of a building, I felt mine shatter. This wasn't a blank slate. It was a grave. Is that it?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "Is that our house?" I couldn't answer. I just walked toward it, pushing through the knee-high weeds. The door hung open on one hinge. I shone my light inside. The floor was rotted through in places, showing the dark earth beneath. A rusty wood stove sat in one corner, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor. Rain and snow had been getting in for years. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. It was colder inside than it was out. We couldn't stay here. It wasn't shelter. It was a trap. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over me. We had come all this way for nothing. We were going to freeze to death on our own damn land. I backed out of the shack, my mind racing, trying to think, trying to find a plan B when there was no plan A. "We need a fire," I said, my voice sounding distant. "We need to find dry wood, under a ledge or something." It was a desperate, pointless task, but it was something to do. It was better than just standing there, waiting for the cold to win. We started searching the perimeter of the clearing, our flashlight beams dancing over rocks and fallen trees. I was near the back of the property, where the hillside rose steeply into a wall of rock, when my light caught something odd. A section of the rock face was different. It was flatter, less natural, with a line of crumbling mortar visible between the stones. It looked like an old retaining wall, maybe for a road that was never finished. And at its base, half hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes and a pile of fallen rock, was a shadow that was too deep, too perfect. It wasn't a shadow at all. It was an opening. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scrambled closer, tearing my hands on the thorns, and shone my light into the gap. The beam didn't hit a back wall. It just went on. It was a tunnel, a dark, straight-cut hole leading into the heart of the mountain. A mine shaft. Fear and curiosity warred within me. A rational person would have backed away. Abandoned mines were death traps, full of bad air, deep shafts, and sudden collapses. But we were not in a rational situation. We were two kids with nowhere to go on a freezing night. The air flowing out of the opening felt different from the damp night air. It was still, and strangely, not as cold. It was dry. "Leo," I called out, my voice tight. "Over here! Bring your light!" He came running, his own beam bouncing wildly. He saw the opening and stopped dead. "What is that?" "I think it's an old mine," I said, my mind racing. "My grandfather, Thomas Vance. He owned this land. Did he dig this? Why? Was he a prospector?" The questions tumbled through my head, but one thought rose above the others. Shelter. It was out of the wind. It was dry. "We have to go in," I said, more to myself than to him. Leo looked from the dark hole to the collapsing shack and then back again. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. There was no other choice. Taking a deep breath, I squeezed through the narrow opening, my duffel bag scraping against the rock. I turned and helped Leo through. We stood together just inside the entrance, our two flashlight beams cutting a single trembling path into the absolute blackness. The silence in here was different. It was a heavy, ancient silence, the silence of the deep earth. We took a tentative step forward, then another, leaving the cold, hostile world behind and walking into the unknown heart of our inheritance. The tunnel was about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, the walls rough-hewn but remarkably straight. It wasn't a natural cave. This was man-made. The floor was packed earth and fine gravel, sloping gently downward. As we moved deeper, the sound of the wind outside faded completely, replaced by the soft crunch of our own footsteps and the thudding of my heart. The air remained still and dry, and the temperature held steady. It was cool, but it was a manageable cellar-like cool, a world away from the biting cold outside. After about 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, roughly 10 feet square, and my breath caught in my throat. This was no abandoned mine. In one corner stood a simple wooden cot, a neatly folded wool blanket and a pillow resting on it. Next to it was a small, sturdy table and a single wooden chair. An old-fashioned kerosene lantern sat on the table, and beside it a box of matches. It was a room. A deliberate, hidden, Spartan little room carved out of the mountain. Someone had lived here, or, at least, had prepared for someone to live here. "Whoa," Leo whispered, his voice full of awe. He walked over to the cot and touched the blanket, as if to confirm it was real. I swept my flashlight around the chamber. Against the far wall there were shelves, also carved from the rock, holding a few canned goods, beans, soup, peaches, their labels faded but intact. There were jugs of water, a small first aid kit, and a stack of books. It was a survival cache, a lifeboat. My eyes fell on a large, dark green metal box tucked under the table. It was an old military-style footlocker, secured with a heavy padlock. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. This was it. This had to be it. "Look for a key," I said, my voice urgent. We searched the small space frantically. We looked under the cot, in the books, on the shelves. Nothing. I was about to suggest we try to break the lock when Leo, who was running his hand along the underside of the table, said, "Got it." He held up a small brass key, which had been taped securely to the bottom of the tabletop. My hands were shaking as I took the key from him. It slid into the padlock with a satisfying click. I lifted the heavy lid. The inside of the box was lined with oilcloth to keep out moisture. The first thing I saw was a thick canvas bag. I lifted it out. It was heavy. I loosened the drawstring, and a corner of my mind registered, with a sense of dizzying disbelief, the green edges of paper money. I didn't count it. I just set it aside, my heart pounding. Beneath the bag was a large, sealed envelope. On it, in the same spidery script as the letter from the lawyer, was my name. Elias. I sat on the edge of the cot, the envelope in my hands. Leo sat beside me, leaning in close. I carefully tore it open. Inside were several pages of thin, almost translucent paper, filled with dense handwriting. I started to read aloud, my voice echoing slightly in the stone room. "My dearest Elias," it began, "if you are reading this, then the world has failed you in the way I always feared it would. And I have failed you by not being there to stop it. I am so sorry. I am sorry for the silence, for the distance, for the years the state has stolen from you and your brother. I hope one day you will understand that my absence was not born of indifference, but of a desperate, complicated kind of protection." I had to stop, my throat thick with emotion. I looked at Leo. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. This was the first direct word from our family we'd had in a decade. It was a voice from the grave, and it was speaking directly to us. I took a shaky breath and continued. "This place, this hole in the ground, is not a tomb. It is a refuge. I built it for you, for this very day. The world outside is loud and cruel and wants to tell you what you are worth. It will measure you in dollars and test scores and failures. Do not listen to it. Your worth is not something that can be appraised by a stranger." The letter went on to explain. He called the mine the quiet place. He had spent years digging it, secretly, by hand. He knew he was getting older, that his health was failing, and he worried constantly about what would happen to us. He couldn't get custody. He was too old, too poor, and had his own legal troubles, he wrote vaguely. So he built this, a final, desperate contingency plan. "There is money in the box," he wrote. "Enough to get you started. Enough for food, for warm clothes, for a new beginning. But the money is the least important part of your inheritance, Elias. The land itself, this worthless, debt-ridden patch of rock, is the key. Do not sell it. Do not let them take it from you. The lawyer, Abernathy, is an honest man, but a practical one. He will not understand. You must be smarter than he is. You must be stronger. He ended the letter with a cryptic instruction. This chamber is only the beginning. It is the antechamber. Your real inheritance lies deeper. When you are ready, when you feel you have no other choice, look for the place where the stone sounds hollow. Trust the mountain. It will keep you safe. Be brave for your brother. I love you both. Your grandfather, Thomas. When I finished reading, a profound silence filled the room. The only sound was the soft hiss of the lantern I had lit. I carefully folded the pages and put them back in the envelope. Then I picked up the canvas bag. I emptied its contents onto the blanket. Stacks of 20s, 50s, and 100s, all bound with rubber bands. We counted it together. It was $20,000. A staggering, life-altering amount of money. Leo just stared at it, his mouth slightly open. He reached out and touched a stack of bills as if it might vanish. For a moment, all I felt was a tidal wave of relief. We were safe. We weren't going to freeze. We weren't going to starve. We had options. We could buy a used car, find an apartment in some small town. I could get a job. Leo could go to school. We could be normal. But then, as the initial shock wore off, a different emotion began to surface, cold and sharp. Anger. Why? Why all the secrecy? Why this elaborate, insane hideaway? If he had this money, why didn't he use it to help us before? Why leave us to rot in the system for 10 years, to be passed around like unwanted baggage, to suffer through things he couldn't even imagine? The letter said it was for protection, but it felt like a betrayal, a grand theatrical gesture that came a decade too late. He just left us, I said, the words tasting like poison. He had all this, and he just left us there. Leo looked up from the money, his expression confused. But he built this for us, Eli. He left us the money. He said he loved us. Words, Leo, I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. They're just words on a piece of paper. Where was he when Mom died? Where was he when they put us in the first home? This is crazy. I stood up and paced the small chamber, my boots scuffing on the stone floor. My mind was a whirlwind of grief and rage. The ghost of my grandfather, this man I barely remembered, had just reached out and thrown our lives into even more chaos. He'd given us a fortune and a riddle, a safe house and a mountain of questions. I felt the crushing weight of responsibility settle on me again, heavier than before. It wasn't just about surviving the night anymore. It was about this legacy, this strange, burdensome gift. What were we supposed to do? Take the money and run? Disappear and try to build a normal life, ignoring his final wishes? Or stay here, on this worthless patch of land, and try to solve the puzzle he'd left us? Stay in this hole in the ground and look for a hollow stone? It sounded like something out of a fairy tale, and we were living in a world that had long since beaten the fairy tales out of us. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed from the entrance of the mine. It was distant at first, then grew louder. A powerful gust of wind blew into the tunnel, making the lantern flame dance wildly. Snow. A storm was hitting. I walked to the mouth of the tunnel and peered out. The world had gone white. Thick, heavy snowflakes were falling so fast I could barely see the trees on the other side of the clearing. The temperature had plummeted. The wind howled like a hungry animal. Any thought of leaving, of going anywhere, was instantly erased. We were trapped. The mountain had made our decision for us. I walked back to the chamber where Leo was sitting on the cot, looking small and scared. I sat down beside him and put an arm around his shoulders. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. My grandfather's motives, his failures, his secrets, none of it mattered right now. All that mattered was the two of us. This mine, this quiet place, was our only shelter. His cryptic letter was our only guide. Running was no longer an option. The outside world was a blizzard. In here, it was still and calm. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Okay, we stay. We'll figure this out. Together." Leo leaned his head against my shoulder. For the first time in years, we weren't just surviving. We had a mission. We were going to find our inheritance. The storm lasted for 3 days. The world outside the mine entrance was a churning vortex of white. We were completely cut off, sealed in our stone sanctuary. The time became a strange, suspended thing, measured not by clocks, but by the lighting and extinguishing of the lantern. We ate the canned food from the shelves, heated the soup over a small, portable stove we found in another supply bin. It was the best food I'd ever tasted. We were warm. We were safe. The initial shock gave way to a kind of quiet routine. During the day, we explored our small chamber, taking a meticulous inventory of everything our grandfather had left. There were tools, a pickaxe, a shovel, a sledgehammer, all in good condition. There were more supplies, bags of rice and beans, dried fruit, coffee. He had planned for a long stay. At night, I would read to Leo from the books on the shelf, old copies of Jack London and Mark Twain. His voice, reading tales of adventure and survival, filled the silence and pushed back the darkness. The mind stopped feeling like a hole and started feeling like a home. It was the first place that had ever truly belonged to us. On the 4th morning, the wind died down. I walked to the entrance and looked out. The world was transformed, buried under 3 feet of pristine, silent snow. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun reflecting off the snow was almost blinding. It was beautiful, but it was also a stark reminder of our isolation. The road would be impassable. No one was getting in or out of Hemlock's Notch for a while. We were on our own. It was time to make a real plan. We still had the money, a powerful temptation. But the storm had changed something in me. It had forced a stillness, a clarity. My grandfather's letter wasn't a burden anymore. It was a map. And I had made a promise to Leo. We would figure it out. "All right," I said, turning back into the chamber. "Let's find this hollow stone." We started methodically. Taking the small sledgehammer from the tool stash, I began tapping along the walls of the chamber, listening intently. Leo followed behind me, his ear pressed against the cold rock. For hours, all we heard was the dull, solid thud of hammer against stone. Thud, thud, thud. It was monotonous, discouraging work. My arms ached. Doubt began to creep back in. Was this a wild goose chase? The ramblings of an old man? We were about to give up for the day when I reached the back wall, the one behind where the cot had been. I tapped the hammer near the floor. Thud. I moved it up a foot. Thud. I moved it to the right. And then I heard it. A subtle change in resonance. It wasn't a loud, obvious boom, but a slight, perceptible shift in pitch. A thunk instead of a thud. "Leo," I whispered. "Listen." I tapped it again. Thunk. His eyes widened. I hear it. It's different. We both pressed our hands against the spot. The rock felt the same as everywhere else, solid and unyielding, but the sound was undeniable. This was it. Stand back, I said, grabbing the full-sized sledgehammer. It was heavy, awkward. I swung it, putting all my weight, all my frustration, all my hope into the blow. The hammer hit the wall with a deafening crack. A web of fractures appeared in the rock face. I swung again, and a chunk of stone the size of a dinner plate broke loose and fell to the floor. Behind it was not more rock, but darkness. We had broken through. Working together, we used the hammer and a crowbar to widen the opening, our hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. The false wall was about a foot thick, cleverly constructed from fitted stones and mortar, disguised to look like the rest of the mine. Behind it, the tunnel continued, just as dark and straight as the first section. A new wave of apprehension washed over me. This felt different. The first chamber was a refuge. This felt like a trespass. Where was he leading us? Taking a deep breath and a fresh lantern, we stepped through the opening. This new section of the mine was immediately distinct. It was more organized, more professional. The walls were smoother, and there were wooden beams supporting the ceiling in places. After about 100 feet, the tunnel opened into a much larger cavern, a natural chamber that had been expanded and modified. And what we saw there made us stop in our tracks. This was not a living space. This was a workshop. A long wooden workbench ran along one wall, covered in geological tools, rock hammers, chisels, brushes, and a set of precise-looking scales. Dozens of wooden trays held carefully labeled rock samples. On the far wall, large hand-drawn maps were pinned to wooden boards, showing topographical lines, geological strata, and color-coded veins running through the mountain. This wasn't a prospector's hideout. This was a geologist's laboratory. My grandfather wasn't just digging for gold. He was studying something. And in the center of the room, on a purpose-built pedestal of flat stones, was another metal box. This one was larger than the first, a heavy-duty trunk secured not with a padlock, but with two complex clasps. There was no key this time, but etched into the lid of the box was a small, intricate drawing of a star constellation. I didn't recognize it. Leo, however, who had devoured every science book he could get his hands on in the group home library, stepped closer. "It's Cygnus," he whispered, tracing the shape with his finger. "The swan, or they call it the Northern Cross." He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the maps, the tools. Then he looked back at the box. He walked over to the workbench where a small, leather-bound book lay open. He pointed to a page. It was a star chart. He then looked at the clasps on the trunk. They weren't just clasps. They were combination dials, marked with degrees instead of numbers. It was a lock, but the combination wasn't a set of digits. It was a set of coordinates. Working together, using the star chart as a guide, Leo called out the celestial coordinates for the 5 brightest stars in the Cygnus constellation. I carefully dialed them into the 2 clasps. With the last number set, there was a loud click. The clasps sprang open. We lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there were no bags of money. There were just journals. A dozen thick, leather-bound notebooks, filled from cover to cover with my grandfather's spidery handwriting. This was it. This was the real inheritance. The story. We sat on the floor of the stone workshop and began to read. I read aloud, my voice the only sound in the deep silence of the mountain. The journals spanned 15 years. They were the secret history of Thomas Vance, a man we had barely known, and the story they told shattered every assumption I had ever made about him. He wasn't a simple prospector. He had been a brilliant, if eccentric, field geologist who had worked for big mining corporations for decades. But he had grown disillusioned with their slash-and-burn methods, their greed, their lack of respect for the land. He quit, cashed in his meager pension, and bought this worthless piece of mountain to live out his days in peace. But a geologist can't stop being a geologist. He began studying his own land, more as a hobby than anything else. And then he found it. Not gold, not silver, something far more valuable to the modern world. The journals described it with a scientist's precision and a poet's awe. A massive, unusually pure deposit of spodumene, a mineral rich in lithium. But it was intertwined with something else, something he had never seen before. A unique crystalline formation, a type of quartz that, due to trace mineral inclusions, seemed to absorb and hold light, giving off a soft, internal glow in the dark. He called it frost fire. The journals detailed his excitement, his careful and secret work to map the extent of the deposit. He knew he was sitting on a fortune, enough to change all our lives. But at the same time, a company called Apex Development began buying up land all over the county. They were a ruthless conglomerate, known for strong-arming landowners, clear-cutting forests, and leaving environmental disasters in their wake. They made him an offer for his land, a laughably low one. He refused, and that's when the trouble started. The journals grew darker. Apex began to harass him. Legal challenges to his property lines, hired thugs who vandalized his shack, anonymous threats. They were trying to break him, to force him to sell. He realized they must have gotten a hint of his discovery from a public geological survey. They didn't know exactly what he had, but they knew it was something, and they wanted it. This was why he couldn't take us in after our mother died. The journals were filled with anguish over the decision. Apex had made it clear they knew he had grandsons. It was an unspoken threat. Bringing two young boys into that situation would have put us directly in harm's way. The state system, as flawed and cold as it was safer than being with him. It was a horrifying, impossible choice, and it broke his heart. So he made a new plan, a desperate, brilliant, crazy plan. He started taking on debt deliberately. He took out loans against the land, let the taxes fall into arrears. He made himself and the property look destitute, worthless, a liability. It was a smokescreen. He hoped Apex would see the mountain of debt and assume there was nothing of value there, that they would give up and move on. He used the loan money to buy the supplies for the mine, for the survival cash, and the rest he put in the box for us. The mine itself was his masterwork. It was his way of securing our inheritance, hiding it in plain sight. He was building us a vault, a fortress disguised as a ruin. The final journal entries were written in a shaky hand. His health was failing. He knew he was running out of time. He wrote about his regret, his fear that we would grow up hating him, thinking he had abandoned us. He laid out his final instructions with painstaking clarity. He included the contact information for Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer, describing him as a man who values rules above all else, which will make him a powerful ally when you can show him the truth. He included detailed instructions on how to file a mineral claim, how to get the ore samples independently assayed, and how to leverage the discovery. The very last entry was short, just a few sentences. This mountain gave me a secret. Now I give it to you. Don't just make yourselves rich, make yourselves whole. Build a home. That's all I ever wanted. Be good to each other. I closed the last journal. The lantern cast long shadows across the stone walls, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I looked at Leo. He had been listening, utterly rapt, for hours. His face was streaked with tears, but he was smiling, a real, genuine smile. "He was a hero," Leo whispered. And in that moment, all the anger, all the bitterness I had felt, washed away, replaced by a profound and aching love for this grandfather I had never truly known. He hadn't abandoned us. He had been fighting for us, in the only way he knew how. He had built us a fortress of debt and secrecy, a legacy hidden in a hole in the ground. He had suffered threats and isolation, all to protect us and preserve our future. I leaned my head back against the cold stone wall and finally let myself cry. I cried for the lost years. I cried for his loneliness. I cried for the little boys who had felt so utterly alone in the world, not knowing a secret war was being waged on their behalf. And I cried with a sense of overwhelming gratitude. Leo moved over and put his arms around me, holding on tight. The roles were reversed. He was comforting me now. We stayed like that for a long time, two brothers huddled together in the heart of a mountain, finally understanding the true meaning of home. It wasn't a building. It was a story. It was a sacrifice. It was a love so fierce it could move mountains, or at least dig a tunnel right through one. The weight on my shoulders hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer the weight of responsibility for our survival. It was the weight of a legacy of resilience, of defiance. And it felt good. It felt right. I knew what we had to do. We spent the next week preparing. We were no longer just surviving. We were soldiers preparing for battle. Following our grandfather's detailed notes, we went deeper into one of the side tunnels he had marked on his maps. There, just as he'd described, was a vein of the frostfire crystal. It was breathtaking. The cavern walls glittered with pale, milky white crystals, some as thick as my arm, that seemed to drink the light from our lanterns and hold it within, emitting a soft, ethereal glow. It was a secret, magical place. We carefully extracted several small, perfect samples, along with core samples of the lithium-rich spodumene ore, wrapping them carefully in cloth, just as the journals instructed. The rest of our time was spent studying. We read the journals again and again, memorizing the geological data, the legal advice, the warnings about apex. We were cramming for the most important test of our lives. When the snow had melted enough that the road was likely clear, we packed a backpack. We took the rock samples, the journals, and $5,000 from the cash box. We left the rest hidden deep in the mine. We hiked down the mountain to Hemlock's Notch, the world feeling new and strange after our time underground. The air was clean and sharp, the sun bright. We weren't the same kids who had walked up this road a few weeks ago. We were different. We had a purpose. Patterson, the store owner, saw us coming. He was standing on his porch, sweeping away the last of the slush. He stopped and watched us approach, a curious look on his face. "Thought that storm might have buried you boys," he said, his voice gruff but with an undercurrent of relief. "We found a good spot," I said simply. I bought a local newspaper and scanned the classifieds until I found what I was looking for. Arthur Abernathy and Sons, by appointment only. I used the payphone outside the store to make the call. A crisp, female voice answered. I asked to speak to Mr. Abernathy, saying it was regarding the estate of Thomas Vance. There was a pause. "Mr. Abernathy is very busy," she said coolly. "He has already corresponded with you on that matter. His advice stands." Please, I said, my voice steady. Just tell him his old friend Thomas Vance left something for him to see. Tell him it's important. I heard a sigh, then a muffled conversation. A moment later, a man's voice, dry as old paper, came on the line. This is Arthur Abernathy. What is this about? Mr. Abernathy, I said. My name is Elias Vance. My brother and I need to see you. We have new information regarding our grandfather's property. He was silent for a long moment. The information I have, he said slowly, is that the property is a worthless, debt-ridden money pit. My advice, son, is to sign the papers I sent you and walk away. There's nothing for you here. With all due respect, sir, I replied, clutching the receiver tightly. You're wrong. His office was on the second floor of the only brick building in town. It was exactly as I'd imagined. Dark wood, leather-bound books, and the smell of old paper. Mr. Abernathy was a tall, thin man in his late 60s, with a fringe of white hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He regarded us with an air of weary impatience, as if we were a problem he had already solved. He gestured for us to sit. "All right, son," he said, steepling his fingers on his large mahogany desk. "You have 10 minutes to explain why you've wasted my time and your own." I didn't speak. Instead, I reached into my backpack. I took out the rock samples and placed them gently on his desk. The dull gray spodumene, and beside it, one of the smaller frostfire crystals. It seemed to gather the light from the dusty office window, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. Abernathy stared at it, his professional mask faltering for just a second. He leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What is this?" he asked. "That," I said, "is our inheritance." Then I took out the journals. I opened the first one to a page I had marked and pushed it across the desk. "And this is the story you don't know." For the next 2 hours he read. He didn't speak. He just turned the pages, his expression shifting from skepticism to curiosity, to shock, and finally to a kind of grudging, astonished respect. He would occasionally stop, pick up one of the rock samples, and hold it to the light, then look back at the meticulous drawings and chemical formulas in the journals. He read about the discovery, the threats from Apex, the impossible choice my grandfather had to make. He read about the creation of the mine, the hiding of the money, the entire, desperate, brilliant plan. When he finally closed the last journal, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He was silent for a long time, staring at the wall. Then he looked at us, at me and Leo, and his eyes were different. The weariness was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective light. He let out a long, slow breath. "Thomas, you magnificent, stubborn old fool," he whispered to himself. He looked at me. "Your grandfather was the most infuriating and the most honorable client I ever had. He never told me any of this." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sleepy town. "They're still at it, you know, Apex. They filed another motion last month. They're trying to get the county to foreclose on the property for the back taxes. They think you're just a couple of kids who will disappear." He turned back to face us, and for the first time I saw a smile on his face. It was a thin, predatory smile. "Well," he said, cracking his knuckles, "they are in for a very, very big surprise." The final phase of the battle was a quiet war, fought not with sledgehammers but with paper. Mr. Abernathy was a master of his craft. He filed for an immediate injunction to halt the foreclosure proceedings, citing new evidence. He sent the ore samples to an independent lab in the city under a cloak of secrecy, and the results that came back were even better than my grandfather had predicted. The lithium concentration was exceptionally high, and the frostfire crystals were identified as a geologically unique formation. They were, in the lab's dry terminology, priceless. A letter arrived at Abernathy's office addressed to me. It was from Apex Development. It was their final offer. $15,000 for the land, a take-it-or-leave-it threat before they seized it for the $12,000 debt. It was the move of a predator that thinks its prey is cornered and helpless. Abernathy laughed when he read it. "The fools," he said. "They're still playing checkers, and your grandfather set up a chessboard 10 years ago." He arranged a meeting. It took place in a sterile conference room in a city 2 hours away. On one side of the table sat 3 men in expensive suits from Apex, their faces smug and condescending. On the other side sat Mr. Abernathy, me, and Leo. The lead lawyer for Apex, a man with a plastic smile and cold eyes, slid a check for $15,000 across the table. "This is a generous offer, Mr. Vance," he said. "It more than covers the outstanding liabilities and leaves you with a little something to start over. Sign the deed and you can walk away from this burden." I didn't look at the check. I looked him right in the eye. "It's not a burden," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It's our home." Then Mr. Abernathy took over. He calmly laid out our position. He presented the lab reports. He presented copies of my grandfather's journals, highlighting the sections detailing Apex's harassment campaign. He presented a preliminary geological survey, prepared by a consultant he'd hired, that valued the mineral rights in the hundreds of millions. The smug looks on their faces evaporated, replaced by pale, slack-jawed shock. By the end of the meeting, they weren't dictating terms. They were begging for a partnership. We didn't sell. We didn't let them take it. Following a plan my grandfather himself had sketched out in his final journal, we formed our own company, the Frostfire Mining Company. We negotiated a leasing agreement with a reputable, ethical mining firm that Abernathy vetted. They would provide the capital and the equipment to extract the lithium. We would retain ownership of the land, a controlling interest in the operation, and sole rights to the frostfire crystals, which we stipulated could only be extracted by hand, preserving the integrity of the caverns. It's been 5 years since that day. The shack is gone. In its place stands a small, beautiful house built from local timber and stone, with a workshop for me and a study for Leo. The roof doesn't sag. The windows look out over a valley that feels like ours. Leo is in college now, studying geology, of course. He spends his summers here, helping me manage the small-scale frostfire operation. We sell the crystals to collectors and artisans, and their quiet, glowing beauty has become something of a legend. The main lithium mine is a model of sustainable practice, a testament to my grandfather's vision. The money is there, more than we could ever need. But my grandfather was right. It's the least important part. The true inheritance was the purpose he gave us, the chance to build something that lasts, to honor his sacrifice, to make a home. Sometimes at night, I walk up to the entrance of the mine. The air is still cool and dry. I go inside, to the first chamber, and I just sit in the silence. I think about the 2 scared kids who stumbled in here, running from a world that had thrown them away. And I think about the old man who spent his last years digging in the dark, lighting a candle of hope that he prayed his grandsons would one day find. He didn't just save us from poverty or homelessness. He saved us from being victims of our own story. He taught us that the darkest, most forgotten places can hold the brightest light. He taught us that home isn't a place you are given, but a place you make, a place you defend, a place you earn. And that's a lesson that I want to share with all of you. So many of us are handed a story we didn't ask for, a story of loss, of struggle, of being counted out. But you are the author of the next chapter. Your legacy isn't just what you're left with, it's what you build, what you choose to protect. So I want you to do two things for me. First, if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Become part of this community where we share these kinds of stories. And second, go down to the comments and tell me about a time you found strength in an unexpected place. Tell me about a time you rewrote your own story. I'll be reading every single one, because your story matters. Thank you for listening.